Good evening, and welcome once more to our quiet corner of history, where the clamor of the past softens into a gentle murmur, perfect for the waning hours of your day. I am your host, Ben, and tonight we set sail not on a voyage of swashbuckling adventure, but into the often overlooked, grim realities of a life that history has perhaps too often gilded with romance, the life of a pirate during the so-called Golden Age. We picture them with tricorn hats and a parrot on their shoulder, a cutlass in hand, free spirits roaming the seas in search of treasure and liberty. But beneath this veneer of adventure, the truth of a pirate's existence was far less appealing. It was a life frequently cut short, riddled with disease, governed by brutal discipline, and steeped in a pervasive dampness and discomfort that few of us could endure for even a short time. During the Golden Age of piracy, roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, thousands chose this perilous path. But why? What drove men, and a very few women, to forsake the relative safety of land, or even the harsh life of a merchant sailor, for something even more precarious? We'll touch upon some of those reasons, but our main focus tonight will be on the daily, grinding hardships that made being a pirate, quite frankly, a miserable endeavor. Forget the buried treasure chests overflowing with gold doubloons, the joyous singing of sea shanties under a starry sky, or the defiant cries of freedom against tyrannical kings. While moments of camaraderie and fleeting riches undoubtedly occurred, they were brief flickers in a life largely defined by suffering, fear, and an early, often gruesome demise. So find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, allow the gentle sounds of our imagined voyage to carry you away from the concerns of your day. We're not here to judge these figures from the past, nor to entirely strip away the mystique that surrounds them. Instead, we'll simply explore the less glamorous, more human side of their story, the reasons why, for all its legendary allure, it truly sucked to be a pirate. Our journey tonight will take us through the squalid conditions aboard their vessels, the horrors of disease and primitive medicine, the unappetizing sustenance that barely kept them alive, the brutal punishments that maintained order, the constant threat of a violent end, and the crushing psychological toll of such an existence. It's a darker voyage than some of our usual explorations, but one that reveals a truth often lost in the popular narrative. And so, with the tide gently ebbing, let us begin. As we drift further into our exploration of pirate life, let us first consider perhaps the most sobering reality of this existence, its brevity. For all the tales of aged pirate captains with weathered faces and long beards, the historical truth paints a far grimmer picture. The average pirate career lasted a mere 2 years before ending in death, typically from disease, injury, or the hangman's noose. 2 years. Consider that for a moment. Most modern careers span decades, with retirement a distant but expected milestone. For the pirate, there was rarely such luxury of time. Their lives burned briefly and often extinguished violently, a stark reality that shaped every aspect of their existence. Historical records from the Golden Age of piracy reveal that most who took up the black flag were young men, typically in their 20s or early 30s. Few lived to see middle age. Even the most notorious names that have echoed through centuries met early ends. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, perhaps the most feared pirate of his era, was killed in battle at approximately 38 years of age. His head was severed and hung from the bowsprit of Lieutenant Maynard's ship as a grisly trophy and warning to others. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, who captured over 400 vessels in his brief career, died at just 39. Charles Vane, another feared captain, was hanged at 39. The infamous William Kidd met the gallows at 56, an almost elderly age by pirate standards. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, two of the few well-documented female pirates, disappeared from historical record while still young women, Red dying in prison of fever. Bonny's fate uncertain, but likely equally grim. This brevity of life created a peculiar mindset among pirates, a fatalism rarely seen in other professions. Contemporary accounts describe pirates facing death with a strange calmness, a phenomenon noted by the Ordinary of Newgate Prison, who counseled many condemned pirates in their final hours. One pirate, when asked if he feared his impending execution, reportedly shrugged and said simply, "It cannot be helped." This wasn't bravado, but rather the culmination of years living with death as a constant companion. The statistical likelihood of a violent end shaped daily decisions and social structures aboard pirate vessels. Why save for tomorrow when tomorrow might never arrive? Why defer to authority when life could end at any moment? This fatalism manifested in the notorious pirate tendency toward immediate gratification, the wild spending sprees when they made port, the heavy drinking, the disregard for long-term consequences. Some historians suggest this awareness of mortality contributed to the democratic nature of many pirate ships, where captains were elected and major decisions put to a vote. If one's life could end at any moment, why spend it under the thumb of a tyrant? Better to have some say in one's fate, however briefly. This democratic impulse, born partly of their precarious existence, was remarkably progressive for its time, though we should be careful not to romanticize it too much, as we'll explore when we discuss discipline and punishment. The constant proximity to death also created strong bonds among crew members. When your life expectancy can be measured in months rather than decades, those you sail with become more than colleagues. They become a surrogate family, perhaps the only witnesses to your brief existence who might remember your name after you're gone. These intense relationships could manifest as fierce loyalty, or conversely, as bitter betrayal when self-preservation instincts took hold. For those few pirates who did manage to survive beyond the average 2 years, the physical toll was immense. Accounts describe men not yet 40, who appeared ancient, missing limbs, covered in scars, bodies broken by scurvy and other diseases, skin weathered beyond recognition by constant exposure to sun, salt and wind. The pirate's body aged at an accelerated rate, a walking testament to the hardships of their chosen path. Sleep, too, was a luxury often denied. Watch schedules, storms, battles, and the constant vigilance required to avoid naval patrols meant that deep, restful sleep was rare. This chronic sleep deprivation further accelerated the aging process and contributed to poor decision-making, accidents, and a general deterioration of health. Perhaps most poignant were the letters occasionally found on the bodies of dead pirates. Messages to wives, children, or parents they would never see again. These rare glimpses into their inner lives reveal men who, despite their choices, maintained connections to the world they had left behind. One such letter, found on a pirate hanged in 1722, read simply, "Mother, forgive your son. I sought fortune and found only an early grave." As we consider the brevity of the pirate lifespan, we must also acknowledge that for many, this choice wasn't made in ignorance of the risks. Most pirates were former merchant sailors or naval men who had witnessed firsthand the dangers of the sea. They chose this path with open eyes, gambling that the potential rewards, however fleeting, outweighed the near certainty of an early death. And what hastened these early deaths more than anything else? Disease, the silent killer that claimed far more pirate lives than any naval broadside or executioner's noose. As we drift into our next topic, we'll explore the medical horrors that made the pirate's short life not only brief, but often agonizing as well. As we continue our journey through the harsh realities of pirate life, we arrive at perhaps the most feared enemy of all seafarers during this era, disease. Far more pirates met their end through illness than through combat or execution. The silent, invisible killers that flourished in the cramped confines of wooden ships claimed countless lives, often in ways far more gruesome than any cutlass or cannon. Chief among these maritime afflictions was scurvy, a condition so prevalent and devastating that it's estimated to have killed more than 2 million sailors between Columbus's first transatlantic voyage and the mid-19th century. Ship owners and governments of the time grimly assumed a 50% death rate from scurvy alone for sailors on any major voyage. According to historical records, scurvy was responsible for more deaths at sea than storms, shipwrecks, combat, and all other diseases combined. The progression of scurvy was particularly horrific, beginning with a lethargy so profound that early medical practitioners mistakenly believed laziness was a cause rather than a symptom of the disease. As vitamin C deficiency took hold, the body would begin to break down at a fundamental level. Joints would ache and swell, the skin would bruise at the slightest touch, creating mottled patterns across the body like macabre artwork. As the disease progressed, the gums would become spongy and the breath fetid. Teeth would loosen in their sockets, sometimes falling out entirely during meals. Internal hemorrhaging would create strange splotches on the skin, and old wounds, perhaps from battles long past, would mysteriously reopen, as if freshly inflicted. The body, in essence, began to come apart at the seams. A survival account written by an unknown surgeon on a 16th century English voyage reveals the true horror of advanced scurvy. It rotted all my gums, which gave out a black and putrid blood. My thighs and lower legs were black and gangrenous, and I was forced to use my knife each day to cut into the flesh in order to release this black and foul blood. I also used my knife on my gums, which were livid and growing over my teeth, and the unfortunate thing was that I could not eat, desiring more to swallow than to chew. Many of our people died of it every day, and we saw bodies thrown into the sea constantly, 3 or 4 at a time. Left untreated, death from scurvy was virtually certain, often from a sudden hemorrhage near the heart or brain. The cruel irony is that scurvy was entirely preventable with adequate vitamin C, found in citrus fruits and fresh vegetables. Yet the connection between diet and the disease wouldn't be fully understood until the late 18th century, too late for countless pirates and sailors who had already met their fate. Scurvy was far from the only disease that flourished in the wooden world of ships. Typhus, known colloquially as ship fever, spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. Carried by lice that infested clothing and bedding, typhus caused high fevers, a distinctive rash, and often delirium. In severe cases, gangrene would set in, turning extremities black before death mercifully arrived. Dysentery, known as the flux, was another common killer. Caused by contaminated food and water, it led to severe diarrhea, often bloody, causing dehydration and eventual death if untreated. The cramped quarters of a ship meant that once dysentery appeared, it spread rapidly through the crew. The constant dehydration weakened men, making them more susceptible to other illnesses and less capable of performing their duties. Malaria, yellow fever, and dengue, collectively known as tropical fevers, awaited pirates who ventured into warmer waters. These mosquito-borne illnesses could decimate a crew in days, causing agonizing deaths marked by high fevers, internal bleeding, and jaundice. Many a pirate expedition ended not with capture or successful plunder, but with a ship drifting aimlessly, its crew too sick to man the sails or even to bury their dead. Beyond these specific diseases, the general conditions aboard ship created a perfect breeding ground for illness of all kinds. Rats carried fleas and disease throughout the vessel. The perpetual dampness led to fungal infections that could rot a man's feet as he stood at his post. The lack of fresh water for washing meant that minor cuts and abrasions, common in the physically demanding work of sailing, frequently became infected. And what medical care awaited the afflicted pirate? Here too, reality fell far short of modern imagination. The ship's surgeon, if one was present at all, typically had minimal training. Many were former barbers or butchers who had learned their craft through apprenticeship rather than formal education. Their medical knowledge was based on humoral theory, the ancient belief that illness resulted from an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The treatments they offered often caused more harm than good. Bloodletting, the deliberate draining of blood from a patient, was a common response to almost any ailment. This practice, based on the belief that illness represented an excess of blood, only weakened already compromised patients. Purging through induced vomiting or diarrhea was similarly common and similarly counterproductive, especially for those already suffering from dehydration. The surgeon's tools were primitive by modern standards: saws for amputations, pliers for tooth extractions, cauterizing irons to seal wounds. Anesthesia consisted of rum, if available, or a leather strap to bite down on. Infections were rampant, as the concept of germ theory wouldn't be established for another century or more. Surgeons moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, unknowingly spreading disease as they went. Amputations were particularly common in maritime medicine. Any significant injury to a limb, whether from combat, accident, or disease, typically resulted in removal of the affected appendage. The procedure was brutally quick: a tourniquet applied, a few cuts through muscle and tissue, a saw through the bone, and finally the cauterizing iron to seal the blood vessels. The entire process might take less than 2 minutes, necessity driving speed in an era before pain management. For those who survived the surgeon's ministrations, recovery was far from assured. Gangrene remained a constant threat, its distinctive smell, described by one surgeon as the odor of wet, rotting wood, a harbinger of doom. Once gangrene set in, further amputation was the only option, moving progressively closer to the torso until either the infection was outpaced or the patient succumbed. The psychological impact of these medical horrors cannot be overstated. Pirates lived with the knowledge that even a minor injury could lead to death or disfigurement. They witnessed their comrades suffer through agonizing procedures and lingering illnesses. The sounds and smells of the sick and dying were inescapable in the confined space of a ship. This constant proximity to medical suffering contributed significantly to the fatalistic attitude we discussed earlier. Perhaps most poignant were the folk remedies that pirates, like all sailors of the time, clung to in the absence of effective medical treatment. Copper bracelets were worn to ward off rheumatism. Pierced ears were believed to improve eyesight. Amulets and talismans of all kinds were carried to protect against specific ailments. These practices speak to the fundamental helplessness felt in the face of disease, a desperate reaching for any control in an uncontrollable situation. As we drift away from these medical horrors, consider that for many pirates, disease represented not just a physical threat, but an existential one. To die in battle was one thing, quick, possibly heroic, witnessed by comrades who might remember your name. To die slowly of illness, perhaps delirious and unrecognizable from symptoms, was a fate many feared far more than the hangman's noose. And where did these diseases flourish most readily? In the cramped, damp, vermin-infested living conditions that characterized life aboard a pirate vessel. As we continue our journey, let us turn our attention to these daily discomforts that, while perhaps less immediately lethal than disease, contributed significantly to the misery of pirate existence. Having explored the brevity of pirate life and the diseases that so often cut it short, let us now turn our attention to the daily living conditions that formed the backdrop of a pirate's existence. For it was not just the dramatic moments of battle or the looming specter of illness that made this life so difficult, but the constant grinding discomfort of their physical environment. The typical pirate vessel was a world unto itself, but hardly a comfortable one. Space was perhaps the most precious commodity aboard ship, and there was precious little of it to go around. The average pirate slept in a hammock, suspended mere inches from his neighbors on either side. These hammocks would be strung in the forecastle or between decks, areas with ceilings so low that standing upright was often impossible. During storms or rough seas, men would be thrown against each other as the ship pitched and rolled, their hammocks swinging in chaotic unison. For those without the luxury of a hammock, typically the newest or lowest ranking crew members, sleep meant finding a spot on the hard wooden deck, perhaps with only a thin blanket or piece of canvas as cushioning. These men would curl up wherever space allowed, often near the cannons or cargo, vulnerable to being stepped on during the night as others moved about the ship. Privacy, a concept we take for granted in modern life, was virtually non-existent. Natural functions were performed in full view of others, using the heads, crude toilets positioned at the bow of the ship, or, in rough weather, whatever receptacle was at hand. Bathing was rare, limited by the scarcity of fresh water, which was prioritized for drinking. Some pirates went months without a proper wash, perhaps occasionally rinsing with seawater, which did little to truly clean and left the skin encrusted with salt. The perpetual dampness of shipboard life cannot be overstated. Wooden ships leaked. This was not a design flaw but an accepted reality. The constant seepage of water through the hull created a permanent moistness below decks. Clothing never fully dried. Bedding remained perpetually damp. This constant humidity contributed to a variety of skin conditions, fungal infections, rashes, and sores that would not heal properly in the wet environment. This dampness, combined with tropical heat in many pirate hunting grounds, created an atmosphere below decks that one naval surgeon of the era described as like breathing in a recently opened tomb. The air was thick, stale, and heavy with the odors of unwashed bodies, rotting food, bilge water, and the tar used to seal the ship. Ventilation was poor at best, with only small hatches allowing fresh air to circulate. Vermin were constant companions on any vessel of the era. Rats thrived in the dark, damp conditions, feeding on the ship provisions and occasionally on sleeping sailors. Contemporary accounts describe men waking to find rats gnawing on their toes or fingers. Beyond the physical damage they caused, rats carried disease and contaminated food supplies. Some ships reportedly had rat populations numbering in the hundreds. Smaller but no less troublesome were the lice and fleas that infested clothing, bedding, and hair. These parasites caused constant itching and discomfort, and as we've discussed, could transmit serious diseases like typhus. Cockroaches skittered through food stores, while weevils and maggots made homes in the ship's biscuit and flour. One pirate's journal entry from 1718 notes with grim humor, "I have become so accustomed to picking weevils from my bread that my fingers do it while my mind wanders elsewhere." The sensory experience of shipboard life was overwhelming in its unpleasantness. The cacophony of sounds was constant. The creaking of timbers, the flapping of sails, the clanking of chains, the calls of men working, the groans of the sick or injured. During storms, the noise would reach deafening levels as waves crashed against the hull and wind howled through the rigging. Even in calm seas, quiet was a rare luxury. The olfactory assault was perhaps even worse. The stench of the bilge, the lowest part of the ship where wastewater collected, was a noxious combination of rotting wood, mold, human waste, and stagnant seawater. This foul odor permeated the entire vessel, stronger below decks but present everywhere. Added to this were the smells of unwashed bodies, the reek of the hold where animals might be kept, and the peculiar musty odor of damp wood and canvas that never fully dried. Temperature regulation was another constant challenge. In tropical waters, the heat below decks could become unbearable, turning the living quarters into what one account described as a floating oven. Men would sleep on deck when possible, risking sudden squalls for the relief of fresh air. Conversely, in northern waters, the cold could be equally punishing. With no heating system beyond small braziers that posed their own fire hazards, pirates would huddle together for warmth, adding layers of whatever clothing they possessed. Weather exposure was an inescapable aspect of pirate life. Those on watch or working the sails endured whatever conditions nature provided. Blistering sun that burned skin to leather, driving rain that soaked to the bone, or freezing spray that could cause frostbite in extreme cases. The elements wore men down over time, aging them prematurely and contributing to chronic ailments like rheumatism and respiratory problems. Sleep deprivation further compounded the misery of these conditions. The watch system meant that sleep was taken in short shifts, rarely allowing for the deep restorative rest that the human body requires. The constant noise, motion of the ship, discomfort of sleeping arrangements, and presence of vermin all made quality sleep elusive. During storms or combat situations, men might go days with only snatches of rest, leading to a state of chronic exhaustion that dulled reflexes and clouded judgment. The psychological impact of these living conditions should not be underestimated. The constant discomfort, lack of privacy, sensory assault, and sleep deprivation created a state of perpetual stress. Modern studies of confined environments like submarines or space stations have shown that such conditions can lead to irritability, depression, and even psychosis over time. Pirates had none of the psychological screening or support systems that modern sailors receive, yet endured conditions far worse for much longer periods. Perhaps most telling are the accounts of pirates who, upon capturing a merchant vessel, would immediately seek out clean clothing, fresh bedding, and private spaces to enjoy a moment's comfort. These small luxuries, which we might take for granted, represented profound relief from their daily existence. One captured merchant captain recorded his surprise at seeing a fearsome pirate quartermaster nearly weep with joy at the discovery of a clean linen shirt and a bar of soap among the cargo. As we drift away from these uncomfortable quarters, consider that these conditions were not occasional hardships, but the constant backdrop against which all other aspects of pirate life played out. Battles were fought, decisions made, and social interactions navigated by men in a state of perpetual physical discomfort, their bodies worn down by the very environment in which they lived. And what sustained these men through such conditions? Certainly not the quality of their diet, which, as we shall explore next, added yet another layer of hardship to their already difficult existence. The food that fueled pirate crews was, in many ways, as unpleasant as their living quarters, and often directly contributed to the diseases we've already discussed. As we continue our journey through the hardships of pirate life, let us turn our attention to what sustained these men through their difficult days, or perhaps more accurately, what barely sustained them. The pirate diet was a far cry from the hearty feasts depicted in Hollywood films. Instead, it was a monotonous, often revolting regimen that contributed significantly to the poor health and shortened lifespans we've already discussed. The foundation of the shipboard diet was ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, a simple mixture of flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until rock hard. These dense, dry crackers were designed for longevity rather than palatability. By the time they were consumed, especially on longer voyages, they had often become infested with weevils, small beetles that burrowed through the biscuits, leaving them riddled with holes and filled with larvae. Contemporary accounts describe sailors tapping their biscuits on the table before eating, hoping to dislodge the worst of the infestation. Others simply ate in the dark, preferring not to see what accompanied their meal. One pirate's journal from 1722 notes with grim humor, "Our biscuit is so full of worms that we can hear them scratching in the bread box like mice. We eat them by the handful, willing or not, for there is no picking them out in the dark." Alongside hardtack came salt beef, or salt pork, meat preserved in brine so heavily salted that it required soaking in seawater before it could be consumed. Even after this preparation, it remained tough, stringy, and often rancid. The preservation process leached most nutrients from the meat, leaving it with little nutritional value beyond basic protein. The texture was described by one sailor as like chewing on the sole of a well-worn boot. Fish was occasionally available when caught fresh, providing a welcome change from salt meat. However, without refrigeration, fish spoiled quickly in warm climates. Pirates might enjoy a single meal of fresh fish before the remainder turned dangerous to consume. Some crews developed techniques for smoking or drying fish to extend its usability, but the results were still far from appetizing by modern standards. Dried peas and beans were staples that stored relatively well, though they too became infested with insects over time. These would be boiled into a thick soup or stew called lobscouse, a catch-all term for whatever ingredients were available thrown into a pot. One naval surgeon described lobscouse as a dish more fit for swine than men, yet devoured with great enthusiasm by sailors who have known nothing else for months. Fresh fruits and vegetables were the most prized and rarest components of the shipboard diet. Their absence, as we've discussed, led directly to scurvy and other deficiency diseases. When a ship made landfall, acquiring fresh produce was a priority, but these items spoiled quickly. Citrus fruits like lemons and limes could last somewhat longer, but were still luxury items that disappeared within weeks of leaving port. Some captains attempted to grow small gardens on deck in boxes or barrels, but the salt spray and limited fresh water made this largely unsuccessful. A few documented cases exist of pirate captains ordering raids specifically to acquire fresh produce rather than treasure, a testament to how valuable these items became during long voyages. Water, that most basic necessity, presented its own challenges. Stored in wooden casks, it quickly became stagnant and foul-tasting. Algae would bloom within the barrels, and small worms and other organisms would multiply, creating what one account described as a slimy soup rather than proper drinking water. By the later weeks of a voyage, men would strain their water through cloth to remove the worst contaminants before drinking. This deterioration of water quality led to the heavy consumption of alcohol aboard pirate vessels. Beer, wine, and especially rum were not merely recreational substances, but survival necessities. The alcohol content made these beverages safer to drink than water in many cases. Rum, in particular, became associated with pirates, partly because of its prevalence in the Caribbean, where many operated, and partly because of its long shelf life compared to beer or wine. The daily rum ration, typically half a pint per man, served multiple purposes. It provided calories, masked the taste of foul water when mixed to create grog, and offered psychological comfort in difficult conditions. However, it also contributed to dehydration, impaired judgment, and dependency. Some historical accounts suggest that alcohol withdrawal during periods when supplies ran low could cause significant disruption aboard pirate vessels, with men becoming irritable, shaky, or even violent. Food preparation aboard ship was primitive at best. The cook worked at a brick firebox called a galley, typically located on the main deck to reduce fire risk. During storms or rough seas, hot meals became impossible as fires could not be safely maintained. At such times, men subsisted on hardtack and whatever could be eaten cold. Even in good weather, cooking was basic. Boiling was the primary method, with little seasoning beyond salt and perhaps a few precious dried herbs. The social aspects of eating aboard pirate ships differed somewhat from naval or merchant vessels. While naval ships maintained strict hierarchies at mealtimes, with officers dining separately on better food, pirate articles, the codes governing their society, often specified equal portions for all. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates notes that on many pirate ships, the captain and the quartermaster were served in the same manner as the lowest man aboard. This egalitarian approach to food was one of the few advantages pirate crews had over their naval counterparts. However, reality often fell short of these ideals. Newly captured provisions would be consumed quickly, with quality deteriorating over time. Those with power or influence might still secure better portions or first access to limited supplies. During times of scarcity, food became a source of conflict, with accusations of hoarding or unfair distribution sometimes leading to violence. The psychological impact of this poor diet extended beyond mere hunger. The monotony of eating the same unappetizing foods day after day created a form of sensory deprivation. Men dreamed of fresh bread, ripe fruit, or properly cooked meat. Accounts from captured pirates frequently mention food as a primary motivation for raiding settlements, not just for survival, but for the simple pleasure of variety and flavor. This constant nutritional stress affected mood, cognitive function, and social dynamics aboard ship. Modern nutritional science has demonstrated clear links between diet and mental health, links that would have been unknown to pirates but keenly felt nonetheless. The irritability, depression, and sometimes irrational behavior noted in historical accounts of pirate crews can be partially attributed to their chronically poor nutrition. Perhaps most telling are the accounts of what pirates did when they captured a well-provisioned merchant vessel. Before seeking treasure or valuables, many crews would raid the food stores, particularly targeting items like cheese, butter, sugar, and spirits. One captured merchant captain described with amazement how his ship's entire store of preserved fruits was consumed in a single day by boarding pirates, with such expressions of pleasure as might be expected from children at a fair. As we drift away from this unappetizing topic, consider that the constant hunger, the struggle to maintain adequate nutrition, and the psychological burden of a monotonous, often revolting diet formed yet another layer of hardship in the pirate's daily existence. And should a pirate complain too vocally about these conditions, or, worse yet, steal more than his allotted share, he would soon become acquainted with the brutal discipline that maintained order in this harsh floating world. As we navigate deeper into the harsh realities of pirate existence, we arrive at a particularly grim aspect of their daily lives, the brutal discipline and punishment that maintained order in this floating world. While popular culture often portrays pirate ships as lawless havens of freedom, historical records paint a very different picture. The discipline aboard many pirate vessels could be as severe and terrifying as that found in the naval and merchant ships many pirates had fled. The foundation of order on pirate ships was the Articles of Agreement, a code of conduct that all crew members signed or marked upon joining. These articles varied from ship to ship, but typically outlined the distribution of plunder, compensation for injuries, and crucially, the punishments for various infractions. By signing, each man acknowledged his consent to be governed and punished according to these rules. While it's true that pirates often operated with more democratic principles than naval vessels, with captains elected rather than appointed, and major decisions put to a vote, this did not translate to leniency when rules were broken. In fact, the precarious nature of their existence demanded strict adherence to the code. A single act of disobedience could endanger the entire crew, and punishment needed to be severe enough to deter others from similar transgressions. Perhaps the most dreaded punishment in the maritime world was keel hauling, a practice so brutal that even hardened sailors spoke of it in hushed tones. The unfortunate victim would be bound with rope, sometimes weighted to ensure proper depth, and then dragged under the ship from one side to the other. As they were pulled beneath the vessel, their body would scrape against the keel, the central structural element running along the bottom of the hull. This keel was typically encrusted with barnacles and other marine growth, creating a surface as abrasive as coarse sandpaper. The victim's skin would be torn away as they were dragged across this surface, resulting in horrific lacerations. If the rope was too short or the process too slow, drowning was a very real possibility. Even those who survived the ordeal faced the significant risk of infection from their wounds, particularly in the bacteria-rich seawater. A Dutch account from 1697 describes a keel hauling in clinical detail. The The sailor emerged on the opposite side of the vessel, alive but with the appearance of having been flayed. The salt water entering his wounds caused him to scream in such a manner that the most hardened men turned away. He survived 3 days in agony before succumbing to fever. While keel hauling is often associated with naval discipline, evidence suggests it was occasionally employed by pirates as well, particularly those with Dutch or North European backgrounds. More common among pirates was flogging, the application of a whip or cat o' nine tails to the bare back of the offender. The cat o' nine tails was a particularly vicious instrument, consisting of 9 knotted cords attached to a handle. Each stroke would leave multiple lacerations, and a typical punishment might involve dozens of lashes. The victim would be tied to the mast, or a grating, often with the entire crew forced to watch as a deterrent. The physical damage from a severe flogging was extensive. The multi-tailed whip would tear away skin and flesh with each stroke, eventually exposing muscle and sometimes even bone. Infection was common, and permanent scarring inevitable. Some victims died during particularly severe floggings, either from shock or blood loss. Others succumbed later to infection. Those who survived carried the scars for life, a permanent reminder of the consequences of transgression. Marooning, the practice of abandoning a crew member on a deserted island or coast, represented a different kind of cruelty. While less immediately painful than keel hauling or flogging, it was often a prolonged death sentence. The marooned pirate would typically be left with minimal supplies, perhaps a small amount of water, a pistol with a single shot, and occasionally a knife or sword. The psychological torment of marooning was perhaps its most insidious aspect. The isolation, the dwindling supplies, the gradual realization that rescue was unlikely. These factors created a mental anguish that many found worse than physical pain. The single pistol shot provided was not primarily intended for hunting or self-defense, but rather as a means of suicide when the situation became unbearable. It was, in its way, considered a mercy. Captain Edward England was known to employ marooning as punishment for those who challenged his authority. Historical records indicate that he abandoned several crew members on various islands in the Indian Ocean. One account tells of a marooned quartermaster who survived for 3 years on a small island before being rescued by a passing ship. When found, he was described as more animal than man, having lost the faculty of speech and the customs of civilization. For lesser offenses, pirates employed a variety of creative punishments. Moses' law, 39 lashes, a biblical reference, was applied for minor infractions. Being ducked involved being tied to a rope and repeatedly plunged into the sea from the yardarm, a practice that could result in near drowning or even death if continued too long. Some pirates were tied to the bowsprit for hours or days, exposed to the elements and repeatedly drenched by waves breaking over the bow. The loss of share, being denied part or all of one's portion of plunder, was another common punishment that, while less physically brutal, could be economically devastating. In a world where the promise of wealth was often the primary motivation, this financial penalty carried significant weight. Some articles specified that repeat offenders would receive increasingly severe share reductions before physical punishment was applied. For the most serious offenses, murder of a crew member, desertion during battle, or theft from the common fund, death was the typical sentence. Execution methods varied, but were generally designed to be both fatal and exemplary. Hanging from the yardarm was common, as was being thrown overboard weighted with shot. Some accounts describe particularly brutal executions, such as being tied to the ship's hull below the waterline at low tide and allowed to drown slowly as the tide rose. What offenses warranted such severe punishments? The Articles of Agreement typically outlined specific transgressions, with gambling, fighting, and theft among the most commonly prohibited activities. Gambling could create dangerous debts and resentments among crew members. Fighting threatened the cohesion necessary for survival. Theft, particularly of food, water, or shared resources, could endanger the entire crew. Sexual violence was also addressed in many pirate codes. Contrary to popular depiction, many pirate articles explicitly prohibited the forcing of women, with severe punishment for violations. This was not necessarily from moral concern, but practical consideration. Sexual violence against captives could provoke greater resistance and retaliation from authorities. Some historians suggest that the relatively low incidence of sexual assault in pirate attacks, compared to naval or merchant raids, may be attributed to these strict prohibitions. The enforcement of discipline fell primarily to the quartermaster rather than the captain, an interesting division of power unique to pirate vessels. While the captain commanded during battle and navigation, the quartermaster handled internal disputes and discipline. This separation helped prevent the abuse of power that was rampant in naval vessels of the time, where captains wielded nearly absolute authority. Despite this check on power, accounts suggest that discipline was inconsistently applied, with favorites sometimes escaping punishment, while those who had fallen from favor received harsher treatment for similar offenses. The democratic ideals expressed in pirate articles often crumbled in the face of human nature, with stronger personalities and factions exerting disproportionate influence over disciplinary decisions. Perhaps most telling about the nature of pirate discipline is how it was viewed by contemporary observers. Naval officers of the era, themselves no strangers to harsh punishment, sometimes expressed shock at the severity of pirate discipline. One British lieutenant, after witnessing the punishment of captured pirates against their own crew members, wrote, "They govern themselves by rules more savage than any nation I have encountered, and enforce these rules with a cruelty that would make even the most hardened naval captain blanch." As we drift away from this dark aspect of pirate life, consider that the brutal discipline aboard these vessels represents yet another contradiction in the romantic myth of piracy. The very men who had often fled the harsh discipline of naval or merchant service found themselves subject to equally severe and sometimes more arbitrary punishment under the black flag. The freedom they sought remained elusive, constrained by the practical necessities of survival and the darker aspects of human nature. As we continue our journey through the hardships of pirate life, we arrive at perhaps the most sobering reality that faced these seafaring outlaws, their likely fate should they be captured. For while disease, harsh conditions, and brutal discipline made daily life difficult, it was the legal consequences of their chosen profession that truly defined the precariousness of their existence. Pirates occupied a unique position in the legal frameworks of the era. They were not merely criminals, but were classified as hostis humani generis, enemies of all mankind. This designation, rooted in ancient Roman law, placed them outside the protection of any nation. A murderer or thief might expect some form of legal process, however rudimentary. A pirate could expect only the most summary justice, if any at all. This legal status meant that pirates could be pursued and captured by vessels of any nation, regardless of their own origin or the flag they sailed under. A French warship could legitimately capture English pirates, and vice versa. More significantly, the normal rules of warfare did not apply to them, while captured enemy sailors during wartime could expect to be treated as prisoners of war, with certain basic rights. Pirates had no such protections. The process of capture was itself often violent. Naval vessels hunting pirates were under no obligation to offer quarter or accept surrender. Many pirate crews fought to the death rather than face capture, knowing what awaited them. Those who did surrender or were captured alive faced a grim sequence of events that would almost invariably end at the gallows. The journey from capture to execution began with imprisonment, typically in the hold of the capturing vessel. Conditions here were abysmal. Dark, cramped spaces where prisoners were often chained to prevent escape attempts or suicide. Food was minimal, just enough to keep them alive for trial. Medical attention for wounds sustained during capture was rare. Many pirates died during this initial confinement from untreated injuries, disease, or deliberate mistreatment. Upon reaching port, pirates would be transferred to local jails to await trial. In London, this meant the infamous Newgate prison, a facility so notorious that many considered it a fate worse than death. Cells were overcrowded and freezing cold, with no drainage system, leaving inmates in the company of their own waste. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and many pirates fell ill before they could even face trial. Only those with sympathetic family or friends willing to buy them food and blankets might have a slightly less miserable experience. Most pirates, however, had long since severed ties with their families or came from such poverty that no assistance was forthcoming. They endured these conditions alone, with only fellow prisoners, often equally desperate and dangerous, for company. The trials themselves were largely ceremonial. The outcome was virtually predetermined, with conviction rates for piracy approaching 100%. Evidence was often minimal. The testimony of the capturing captain might be sufficient. Defense counsel, if provided at all, had little motivation to vigorously represent such universally reviled clients. Many trials lasted less than a day, some merely hours. The Ordinary of Newgate, the prison chaplain, would visit condemned pirates to offer spiritual counsel and, more practically, to extract confessions and life stories that could be published for profit. These last dying speeches became popular literature, selling for 3 to 6 pence to a public fascinated by pirate tales. The Ordinary could earn up to £200 a year from these publications, nearly £22,000 in today's currency, creating a financial incentive to sensationalize the accounts. Following conviction, execution was typically swift. Pirates were transported to execution dock on the banks of the Thames, the location chosen symbolically to represent the maritime nature of their crimes. The procession to the gallows became a public spectacle, with crowds lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the condemned. Some pirates faced this final journey with defiance, others with resignation or religious penitence. The execution itself was designed to be both painful and exemplary. The noose used for pirates was shorter than standard, causing death by slow strangulation rather than the quicker breaking of the neck. This prolonged suffering could last up to an hour, with the victim's limbs jerking uncontrollably in what became known as the Marshal's Dance. The public nature of these executions served a dual purpose: entertainment for the masses and warning to potential pirates. After death, further indignities awaited. Bodies of particularly notorious pirates were often covered in tar and hung in iron cages called gibbets at the entrance to harbors. These grisly displays would remain until the bodies decomposed or were consumed by birds, sometimes for years, serving as a constant reminder of the fate awaiting those who chose piracy. The location of these gibbets, at the mouth of harbors or along busy shipping channels, ensured maximum visibility to sailors. The legal persecution extended beyond the pirates themselves to those who aided them. Harboring pirates, trading with them, or even failing to report their presence could result in severe penalties. Coastal communities suspected of supporting pirates might face collective punishment, with authorities burning homes or seizing property. This created a climate of fear and suspicion in many port towns, with neighbors informing on neighbors to avoid being implicated themselves. For the families of executed pirates, the consequences were equally severe. Wives became widows, often with no means of support. Children lost fathers and faced social ostracism. One pirate, Walter Kennedy, in his final speech before execution, urged people not to judge his wife for his actions, as she had always admonished him for his vicious ways. Such pleas rarely had effect. The families of pirates were typically shunned, forced into poverty and marginalization. The psychological impact of this inevitable end haunted pirates throughout their careers. They lived with the knowledge that capture meant not just death, but a particularly painful and humiliating one. This awareness shaped their decisions, their relationships, and their worldview. Some responded with fatalism. The pirate phrase, "a short life but a merry one," reflects this acceptance of their likely fate. Others developed elaborate plans for escape or disguise, should capture seem imminent. This constant proximity to a violent legal end created a unique temporal perspective among pirates. Their focus was intensely present-oriented, with little thought given to long-term planning or future security. Why save when tomorrow might bring the noose? Why moderate behavior when excess today might be your last opportunity for pleasure? This mindset, while understandable, often led to self-destructive patterns that further shortened already precarious lives. Perhaps most poignant are the accounts of pirates who, facing imminent execution, expressed regret not for their crimes, but for the pain their choices would inflict on those they left behind. Letters written from condemned cells to wives, children, and parents reveal men grappling with the consequences of their actions in their final hours. One such letter, found among the effects of a pirate executed in 1722, reads simply, "Mother, forgive your son. I sought fortune and found only an early grave." As we drift away from this somber topic, consider that the legal persecution of pirates represented not just the enforcement of law, but the maintenance of a global economic system. Pirates threatened trade, the lifeblood of emerging empires. Their harsh treatment served as both punishment and deterrent, a message that those who challenged the established order would face consequences far worse than the hardships they sought to escape through piracy. As we navigate deeper into the realities of pirate life, let us turn our attention to an aspect that perhaps most starkly contradicts the romantic myths, the economic reality of piracy. Popular culture has long depicted pirates as wealthy men, their ships laden with treasure chests overflowing with gold doubloons and precious gems. The truth, however, was far less glamorous and represents yet another way in which the pirate's life fell short of its legendary appeal. The fundamental economic promise of piracy was simple and alluring. Rather than laboring for years as a merchant sailor or naval seaman for meager wages, one could seize wealth directly through force. A successful raid might yield in a single day what would take years to earn through legitimate means. This promise drew many to the black flag, particularly those from impoverished backgrounds with few other prospects for advancement. Reality, however, rarely matched this dream. While occasional spectacular hauls did occur, such as when Bartholomew Roberts captured a Portuguese treasure ship in 1721, these were exceptional events, not the norm. The vast majority of pirate captures yielded far more modest returns. Merchant vessels typically carried practical cargo, foodstuffs, timber, cloth, or manufactured goods, rather than chests of gold and silver. Converting these goods to usable currency presented another significant challenge. Pirates couldn't simply sail into a legitimate port and sell their stolen cargo on the open market. Instead, they relied on a network of corrupt officials, unscrupulous merchants, and isolated communities willing to trade with them. These middlemen extracted steep discounts, often paying pirates a fraction of the true value of their plunder. The distribution of whatever wealth was acquired followed a system outlined in the ship's articles. Contrary to popular belief, this was rarely an equal division. The captain typically received 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, and specialists like the surgeon, carpenter, or gunner might receive 1.25. Ordinary crew members received a single share. This system, while more equitable than naval or merchant practice, still created significant disparities. Before this division occurred, numerous deductions were made from the total. Compensation for injuries came first. Specific amounts for lost limbs, eyes, or other injuries sustained during battle. The ship itself required a share for repairs and maintenance. Provisions needed to be purchased. Only after these expenses were covered would the remaining sum be divided among the crew according to their shares. The timing of payouts created additional economic hardship. Unlike merchant sailors who might receive wages at regular intervals, pirates only profited when they successfully captured prizes. Weeks or even months might pass between significant hauls, creating periods of financial drought. During these lean times, many pirates accumulated debts that would be settled from their next share, further reducing their eventual take. When pirates did receive a payout, their spending habits often ensured that wealth was fleeting. Upon reaching a friendly port, many engaged in spectacular spending sprees, drinking, gambling, and purchasing luxuries they had long been denied at sea. Contemporary accounts describe pirates paying absurd sums for basic pleasures. One reportedly paid a prostitute her weight in silver for a single night, while another bought a hat for the equivalent of several months' naval wages. This pattern of feast and famine created a cycle that kept most pirates perpetually on the edge of poverty, despite occasional windfalls. The pirate who carefully saved his earnings was rare indeed. More common was the man who, having spent his last coin, was forced back to sea, not by love of adventure but by simple economic necessity. As one captured pirate reportedly told his interrogators, "I went to sea to get what I could, and spent it as fast as I got it, and had rather be hanged than live poor." The myth of buried treasure, so central to pirate lore, has little historical basis. With few exceptions, pirates spent or traded their plunder quickly, rather than hoarding it. The practical challenges of secretly burying significant wealth, creating accurate maps, and later retrieving it made this an impractical strategy. The few documented cases of buried pirate treasure typically involved temporary concealment during pursuit rather than long-term storage. Competition further eroded potential profits. The golden age of piracy saw hundreds of pirate vessels operating in the Caribbean and along the American coast. This concentration meant that merchant vessels became increasingly well-armed and traveled in protected convoys. The most vulnerable targets were quickly exhausted, forcing pirates to take greater risks for diminishing returns. Naval response also intensified as piracy threatened colonial commerce. By the 1720s, dedicated anti-piracy patrols had become common, forcing pirates into less profitable regions, or into increasingly dangerous confrontations. The costs of evading these patrols, in terms of time, resources, and risk, further reduced the economic viability of piracy as a profession. For those few pirates who did amass significant wealth, the challenge of retirement proved nearly insurmountable. A former pirate could not simply return to England or the American colonies and live openly on his ill-gotten gains. The constant risk of recognition and arrest meant that even successful pirates often lived in fear, unable to fully enjoy their wealth. Some sought amnesty through official pardons, but these were unreliable and often revoked when politically expedient. The few documented cases of successful retirement typically involved pirates who managed to establish new identities in remote locations, often at the cost of severing all previous connections. Henry Every, after capturing an immensely valuable Indian treasure ship in 1695, disappeared from historical record, likely living under an assumed name until his death. Such clean escapes were exceptional rather than typical. Perhaps most telling are the financial circumstances in which most pirates died. Court records and prison accounts reveal that the vast majority went to their graves with little or no property. The inventory of possessions for executed pirates typically listed only clothing and perhaps a few personal items of minimal value. The pirate who died wealthy was so rare as to be practically non-existent in the historical record. This economic reality created a cruel irony. Men who risked everything for wealth typically ended with nothing, while the merchants and officials who facilitated their activities often prospered. The true beneficiaries of piracy were rarely the pirates themselves, but rather the network of corrupt governors, merchants, and innkeepers who provided them safe harbor and purchased their goods at steep discounts. As we drift away from these economic disappointments, consider that the financial hardships of pirate life represented yet another broken promise. The dream of quick wealth that lured many to piracy proved largely illusory, replaced by a reality of uncertain income, exploitation by middlemen, and brief periods of prosperity followed by extended hardship. The treasure chests of legend were, for most, nothing more than a fantasy that died hard against the shoals of economic reality. And what of those who, disillusioned by the economic realities of piracy, wished to return to legitimate society? Here too, they faced significant obstacles, as we shall explore next in our examination of the forced service and lack of freedom that characterized the pirate's existence. As we continue our exploration of pirate hardships, let us examine a particularly bitter irony of the pirate's existence, the lack of freedom that pervaded a life ostensibly chosen for its liberty. While piracy has often been romanticized as the ultimate expression of freedom from authority, the historical reality reveals a much more complex and often contradictory experience, beginning with how many men became pirates in the first place. Contrary to the popular notion that all pirates willingly chose their outlaw status, many were coerced into service through various means. Chief among these was the practice of forced recruitment following the capture of merchant or naval vessels. When pirates took a prize, they typically offered the captured crew a stark choice: join the pirates or face death. While this was sometimes presented as a free choice, the circumstances made it anything but voluntary. Contemporary accounts describe captured sailors being held at sword or pistol point while making this decision. Some were given only moments to choose, with the alternative being immediate execution or marooning on a deserted island. Others were subjected to torture or threats against fellow crew members to secure their cooperation. Under such duress, many men volunteered for piracy, not out of desire, but simple survival instinct. Even before encountering pirates, many sailors had already experienced forced service through the notorious press gangs that supplied manpower to naval and merchant vessels. These organized groups of ruffians roamed port cities, particularly in England, forcibly recruiting men with seafaring experience. Their methods were brutal and direct. Potential recruits would be knocked unconscious, drugged, or simply overwhelmed by superior numbers and dragged aboard waiting ships. Thomas Urquhart's experience, documented in a letter from 1808, provides a vivid illustration of these tactics. While walking through London with his wife and sister-in-law, he was accosted by strangers who demanded his name. When he protested, several men seized him, struck him on the head, and dragged him along the street. "They tore my coat from my back," he wrote, "and afterwards pulled me by the neck for 50 yards until life was nearly exhausted." Only the intervention of passers-by prevented his abduction into naval service. For those who had experienced such treatment in legitimate maritime service, piracy sometimes represented an escape from even worse conditions. Naval discipline was notoriously harsh, with captains wielding nearly absolute power. Food rations were meager, pay was low and often withheld, and punishments were severe and capricious. In this context, the relatively democratic structure of pirate ships could appear as liberation, even if it came with its own significant constraints. Once aboard a pirate vessel, whether by choice or coercion, the much vaunted freedom of pirate life revealed its limitations. The Articles of Agreement that governed pirate ships, while more democratic than naval regulations, still imposed significant restrictions on individual liberty. These codes typically prohibited gambling, fighting, and unauthorized drinking, activities one might expect to be permitted in a truly free society. Movement was perhaps the most obvious restriction. Once at sea, crew members could not simply leave if they became disillusioned with pirate life. The isolated nature of ships meant that desertion was only possible when near land, and even then carried significant risks. Pirates who abandoned their crews faced not only the wrath of their former comrades if recaptured, but also the danger of arrest by authorities if they attempted to reintegrate into legitimate society. The constant suspicion that pervaded pirate vessels further eroded any sense of freedom. Captains and quartermasters remained vigilant for signs of mutiny or desertion, particularly as naval pressure increased and governments offered pardons to pirates who betrayed their comrades. This created an atmosphere where casual conversations could be misconstrued as plotting, and expressions of discontent might lead to accusations of disloyalty. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Historical records contain numerous accounts of pirate crews turning on each other, either due to disputes over plunder, leadership challenges, or attempts to secure pardons by delivering fellow pirates to authorities. The case of Captain William Kidd is instructive, abandoned by much of his crew and eventually betrayed by those he considered allies. His story illustrates the fragility of pirate loyalty when self-preservation was at stake. For those who had been forced into piracy, the lack of exit options was particularly cruel. Having been coerced into an outlaw existence, they found themselves trapped by the legal consequences of actions they may not have willingly committed. As piracy became more aggressively prosecuted, authorities showed little interest in distinguishing between willing participants and those who had joined under duress. All faced the same harsh penalties if captured. Some pirates attempted to secure official pardons, which were periodically offered by colonial governments seeking to reduce pirate activity. However, these pardons were often unreliable, subject to political whims, and frequently revoked when convenient. The case of Benjamin Hornigold, who accepted a pardon and then became a pirate hunter, was exceptional. More typical was the experience of those who surrendered only to find the promised clemency withdrawn, leaving them to face the gallows despite their cooperation. The racial dynamics aboard pirate ships present another complex aspect of this freedom narrative. While pirate vessels were notably more diverse than their naval counterparts, with crews including Europeans, Africans, and occasionally indigenous peoples, this inclusion had significant limitations. Many black crew members were formerly enslaved people who had been captured along with the ships they served on. While they might experience more equality aboard pirate vessels than in colonial society, their options remained severely constrained. If captured, black pirate crew members faced particularly harsh treatment. While white pirates could expect execution, black pirates, especially those who had escaped slavery, might be returned to enslavement, a fate many considered worse than death. This created an additional layer of entrapment for these crew members, for whom there was truly no going back to legitimate society under any circumstances. The psychological impact of this constrained freedom was profound. Many pirates developed a fatalistic outlook, recognizing that their choices had narrowed to a path that likely ended at the gallows. This fatalism manifested in the reckless behavior and short-term thinking that characterized many pirate crews. If escape from their situation seemed impossible, why not embrace the present moment, regardless of consequences? Perhaps most poignant are the accounts of pirates who, upon capture, expressed not just fear of punishment, but relief that their uncertain existence had reached a conclusion. One pirate, awaiting execution in 1722, reportedly told the Ordinary of Newgate that he welcomed death as an end to wandering, always looking over my shoulder, never at peace. This sentiment reveals the psychological burden of a life that promised freedom but delivered a different kind of confinement. As we drift away from this examination of pirate freedom, or the lack thereof, consider that the very concept of liberty that drew many to piracy proved largely illusory. The democratic structures and escape from naval discipline came at the cost of new constraints, legal persecution, limited mobility, constant suspicion, and for many, no path back to legitimate society. The black flag, rather than a symbol of liberation, became for many a mark of inescapable commitment to an increasingly desperate path. This constrained existence, combined with the physical hardships we've already explored, created significant psychological burdens for those who lived under the black flag. It is to these mental and emotional challenges that we now turn our attention as we continue to unravel the many ways in which the reality of pirate life fell short of its romantic image. As our journey through the hardships of pirate life continues, we arrive at a dimension often overlooked in popular accounts: the profound psychological toll exacted by this precarious existence. Beyond the physical dangers and discomforts we've explored, pirates endured mental and emotional challenges that shaped their behavior, decisions, and ultimately their fate. These psychological burdens, while less visible than scurvy or the hangman's noose, were no less real in their impact. Perhaps the most fundamental psychological challenge was the isolation from mainstream society. By choosing or being forced into piracy, men severed connections with family, community, and the social structures that typically provided stability and meaning. Letters found among pirates' possessions reveal the emotional weight of this separation. Messages to wives never sent, inquiries about children never answered, farewells to parents never delivered. This isolation was compounded by the knowledge that return to legitimate society was increasingly difficult as one's piratical career progressed. Each raid, each act of violence, each ship taken, pushed the pirate further from any possibility of redemption or reintegration. The psychological impact of this one-way journey, the gradual realization that there was no going back, created a particular kind of despair documented in several pirate journals and confessions. One such confession, recorded by the Ordinary of Newgate from a pirate awaiting execution in 1722, captures this sentiment. "I knew after the first ship we took that I was damned in this world, and likely the next. Each further act seemed of little consequence after that realization." This fatalism, born of isolation and irreversibility, influenced decision-making in ways that often accelerated the pirate's journey toward destruction. The constant proximity to violence and death created another layer of psychological distress. Pirates regularly witnessed or participated in acts of brutality that would be considered traumatic by modern standards. While the culture of the time may have normalized violence to a greater degree than our own, historical accounts suggest that many pirates struggled with the psychological aftermath of battle, torture, and execution. Nightmares, excessive drinking, and erratic behavior, all documented in contemporary accounts of pirate life, align with what we would now recognize as symptoms of trauma. Without modern understanding of psychological injury or methods for addressing it, pirates developed their own coping mechanisms, many of which proved maladaptive in the long term. Alcohol and opium provided temporary escape, but ultimately compounded their difficulties. The unpredictability of pirate existence created a state of perpetual anxiety that wore away at mental resilience. Each day brought the possibility of naval encounter, storm, disease outbreak, or betrayal from within. This constant state of alertness, what modern psychology would term hypervigilance, exhausted the mind as surely as physical labor exhausted the body. Sleep, when it came, was often disturbed by both practical concerns, watch schedules, storms, and psychological ones, nightmares, anxiety. Social dynamics aboard pirate vessels added another dimension of psychological stress. While pirate ships operated with more democratic principles than their naval counterparts, they were still confined spaces where dozens or even hundreds of men lived in close proximity for months at a time. Conflicts were inevitable, and the intensity of these relationships, both positive and negative, was amplified by the isolated environment. Friendships formed aboard pirate ships could be profound, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended self-interest. Historical records contain numerous accounts of pirates risking their lives to rescue wounded comrades or sharing limited resources with sick friends. Yet these same intense connections made betrayal or loss all the more devastating. The death of a close companion in battle or from disease could trigger profound grief with few healthy outlets for expression. The psychological impact of leadership roles aboard pirate vessels deserves particular attention. Captains and quartermasters bore the weight of decisions that determined the survival of the entire crew. The democratic nature of pirate governance meant that these leaders could be deposed if they lost the confidence of their men, a constant pressure that created its own form of anxiety. Historical accounts describe several pirate captains who suffered what appear to be nervous breakdowns under this strain. For those who had been pressed into service or joined under duress, the psychological burden included a particular form of cognitive dissonance. These reluctant pirates had to reconcile their self-image as honest men with actions that violated both law and often their own moral codes. This internal conflict manifested in various ways. Some compartmentalized their piratical activities, others embraced a fatalistic identity, as the villain society had labeled them, while some sought redemption through small acts of mercy amid broader violence. The psychological impact of injury and disfigurement cannot be overlooked. In an era before reconstructive surgery or effective prosthetics, pirates who lost limbs, eyes, or suffered facial wounds lived with permanent, visible reminders of their violent profession. Beyond the practical limitations these injuries imposed, they carried social and psychological consequences. A man with a missing hand or eye would be immediately suspect in legitimate society, his body itself becoming a mark of his outlaw status. Perhaps most poignant was the psychological burden of anticipated death. As we've discussed, pirates lived with the knowledge that their careers would likely be brief and end violently. This awareness created a particular relationship with mortality that few other professions experienced. Some responded with bravado and recklessness. The famous pirate motto, "A short life but a merry one," captures this approach. Others developed ritualistic behaviors or superstitions in attempts to exert some control over their fate. The accounts of pirates facing execution reveal the culmination of this psychological journey. Some maintained defiance to the end, others collapsed into terror or religious penitence. Many exhibited a strange calmness that contemporary observers found unsettling. The Ordinary of Newgate described one pirate as facing death with neither fear nor hope, as if he had already departed this world in his mind long before the noose claimed his body. For those few pirates who did manage to survive and escape the life, psychological scars often remained. Historical records contain accounts of former pirates who, having secured pardons or established new identities, continued to struggle with nightmares, paranoia, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. One such man, living under an assumed name in colonial New York in the 1730s, was reported to start violently at loud noises and sleep with a knife under his pillow, though 20 years had passed since he last saw a ship's deck. The cumulative psychological toll of pirate life, the isolation, violence, unpredictability, and anticipated death, created a mindset that both reflected and perpetuated the hardships of their existence. Without modern understanding of mental health or therapeutic interventions, pirates were left to manage these psychological burdens through whatever means they could devise, often with tragic consequences for themselves and others. As we drift away from these psychological depths, consider that the romantic image of carefree pirates, unburdened by convention and reveling in freedom, bears little resemblance to the complex, often tormented inner lives suggested by historical evidence. The psychological reality of pirate existence was as harsh in its way as the physical conditions they endured, another dimension of why, beneath the veneer of adventure, it truly sucked to be a pirate. And yet, despite all these hardships, physical, economic, legal, and psychological, the myth of the pirate has endured and transformed over centuries, becoming something quite different from the historical reality. As we approach the conclusion of our journey, let us examine this curious legacy and the contrast between pirate mythology and the grim reality we've explored. As our journey through the harsh realities of pirate life draws to a close, we find ourselves returning to the question that began our exploration: why has the image of the pirate been so thoroughly romanticized when the historical reality was so grim? How did a life defined by disease, violence, discomfort, and almost certain early death transform in our collective imagination into a symbol of freedom and adventure? Perhaps the answer lies in the very hardships we've explored. The pirate, for all his miseries, represented something powerful in the human spirit. The refusal to accept the limitations of a rigid social order, the courage, however misguided, to seek a different path, the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of something better. In an era when most lives were constrained by birth and circumstance, even the brief, brutal freedom of piracy held a certain dark allure. The transformation of the pirate image began almost immediately. Even during the Golden Age itself, the public's fascination with pirates created a market for sensationalized accounts, with publishers often embellishing or entirely fabricating stories to satisfy this appetite. The last dying speeches of executed pirates, ostensibly recorded by the Ordinary of Newgate, were frequently enhanced for dramatic effect. These early publications laid the groundwork for the romanticized pirate that would later populate novels, plays, and eventually films. By the 19th century, with actual piracy in decline, authors like Robert Louis Stevenson could reimagine pirates as complex, even sympathetic characters. His Treasure Island, published in 1883, introduced many elements that would become staples of pirate mythology: the treasure map, the one-legged seaman, the parrot companion. These literary pirates, while still villainous, possessed a charisma and code of honor largely absent from their historical counterparts. The 20th century completed this transformation through film, with actors like Errol Flynn and later Johnny Depp portraying pirates as dashing, witty rebels rather than the desperate, often brutal men revealed by historical records. These fictional pirates lived lives of adventure and romance that bore little resemblance to the squalid, painful existence we've explored. Their ships were clean, their crews loyal, their treasures abundant, a fantasy that obscured the harsh realities of actual pirate life. This sanitization of pirate history reflects a broader human tendency to romanticize the past, particularly its outlaws and rebels. We remember the brief moments of freedom and forget the constant hardships. We celebrate the occasional spectacular success and overlook the far more common tragic endings. We admire the defiance without fully acknowledging its consequences. Yet there is value in examining the unvarnished reality, as we have done in our journey tonight. Understanding the true hardships of pirate life, the disease, the violence, the squalor, the psychological toll, gives us a more complete picture of this chapter in maritime history. It allows us to see pirates not as cartoon characters or romantic heroes, but as complex human beings making difficult choices in a harsh world. Many who turned to piracy did so because their alternatives seemed even worse. The brutal conditions aboard naval vessels, the exploitation of merchant sailors, the limited opportunities for advancement in a rigidly stratified society. These factors pushed men toward piracy as much as any pull of adventure or wealth. Understanding this context doesn't excuse their actions, but helps explain them, adding depth to our historical perspective. For the brief period they existed, pirate ships did represent something unusual in their time. Communities where men of different nationalities, races, and social backgrounds could achieve positions based partly on merit rather than birth. The democratic elements of pirate governance, while often overstated in popular accounts, were genuinely progressive for their era. These positive aspects existed alongside the brutality and hardship, creating a complex legacy that resists simple categorization. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from our exploration is the reminder that history is rarely as simple or as glamorous as its popular representation. The real pirates were neither the one-dimensional villains of official accounts, nor the romantic heroes of fiction. They were men, and occasionally women, making choices within the constraints of their time, suffering consequences both chosen and unchosen, living lives that were indeed nasty, brutish, and short. As we conclude our journey, I invite you to carry this more nuanced understanding of pirate life with you. The next time you encounter a romanticized pirate tale, perhaps you'll remember the scurvy-ridden sailors, sleeping in damp hammocks, eating weevil-infested biscuits, and living with the constant knowledge that the noose likely awaited them. This awareness doesn't diminish the drama of pirate stories, but enriches them with the complexity of historical truth. The sea has always been a place of both possibility and peril, freedom and constraint, life and death. The pirates who sailed its waters embodied these contradictions, seeking liberty while often finding new forms of confinement, chasing wealth while frequently finding poverty, defying authority while creating their own harsh codes. Their story, stripped of romantic gloss, reminds us of both the allure and the cost of rebellion against established order. As the gentle sounds of our imagined vessel fade, and as you perhaps drift towards sleep, consider that the true value of historical exploration lies not in judgment, but in understanding. The pirates of the Golden Age were neither heroes to emulate, nor simple villains to condemn. They were human beings, navigating a difficult world with the tools available to them, making choices that brought both moments of triumph and far more often tremendous suffering. Their legacy lives on, transformed by centuries of storytelling into something quite different from the historical reality. Yet beneath the eye patches and parrots, the buried treasure and the walking of planks, lies a more complex and ultimately more human story. One of brief freedom purchased at terrible cost, of rebellion with profound consequences, of lives that, for all their mythologizing, few of us would truly wish to have lived. Sleep well, and perhaps dream not of the romanticized pirate adventures, but of the quiet gratitude that you need not endure the harsh realities we've explored tonight. The disease, the violence, the squalor, and the almost certain early death that defined what it truly meant to be a